The radio crackled with static aboard the USS Enterprise as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his headset, unaware that he was about to participate in what would become the most decisive naval battle in the Pacific Theater. It was June 3, 1942, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the carrier's flight deck as American forces prepared for what many believed would be their last stand in the Central Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, studying intelligence reports that seemed almost too good to be true. Thanks to the brilliant codebreakers of Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rockford, the Americans had achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare. They knew exactly when and where the enemy intended to strike. The Japanese plan, designated Operation Me, called for a massive assault on Midway Atoll, a strategic airbase that served as America's forward sentinel in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet approaching Midway was formidable beyond imagination. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had assembled the largest naval armada in Japanese history. For fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu formed the heart of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's striking force. These floating fortresses carried over 270 aircraft, manned by some of Japan's most experienced pilots, veterans of campaigns from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. According to historical records from the Naval War College, Yamamoto's strategy was elegant in its simplicity: lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle, where superior Japanese numbers and experience would crush American naval power once and for all. The Japanese admiral believed that after 6 months of uninterrupted victories, his forces were invincible. His confidence was not unfounded since December 7, 1941. Japanese forces had conquered an empire spanning from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. But Nimitz possessed something Yamamoto did not: complete knowledge of enemy intentions. The American admiral had positioned his 3 available carriers Enterprise, Hornet, at Yorktown northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, included Enterprise and Hornet with their escorts. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, centered around the hastily repaired Yorktown, still bearing scars from the Battle of the Coral Sea fought just 1 month earlier. The disparity in forces was staggering. The Japanese brought for large carriers with seasoned air groups, while the Americans could field only 3 carriers, one of which had been patched together in a mere 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese naval aviators had been training and fighting continuously for years, while many American pilots had never seen combat. On paper, it appeared to be a mismatch of epic proportions. Yet as dawn approached on June 4, 1942, something intangible hung in the Pacific air, a sense that destiny itself was holding its breath. The fate of the Pacific War, perhaps the entire conflict, would be decided in the next 24 hours. The American carriers maintained radio silence as they cut through the dark waters, their crews unaware that they were sailing toward what would become known as the Miracle at Midway, a battle that would transform the course of World War II and shift the balance of power in the Pacific forever. At 0 for 30 hours on June 4, 1942, the first Nakajima B-5N Cape bombers began launching from the deck of the Akagi, their engines roaring to life in the pre-dawn darkness. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet was executing the opening phase of what they believed would be Japan's greatest naval victory. The morning attack on Midway Atoll would soften American defenses. Before the main invasion fleet arrived to claim this strategic prize, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the first wave of 108 aircraft toward Midway: 36 Cape bombers, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. As the formation disappeared into the gray morning sky, Nagumo felt confident in his overwhelming superiority. His 4 carriers possessed more combat experience than the rest of the world's navies combined, and their pilots were the elite of Japanese naval aviation. But unknown to Nagumo, American eyes were already watching. On Midway itself, Navy radar operators had detected the incoming Japanese formation while it was still 150 miles away. At 05:53 hours, the air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as every available American aircraft scrambled to meet the threat. Captain Simmert, commanding Midway's defenses, launched every operational plane obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffaloes, aging Grumman F-4F Wildcats, and even ancient Douglas SPD Dauntlesses pressed into fighter service. The aerial battle over Midway was a massacre. The Japanese Zeros, piloted by veterans of countless campaigns, tore through the American defenders with ruthless efficiency. Marine Fighting Squadron 221, flying the hopelessly outmatched Buffaloes, lost 15 of 25 aircraft in minutes. Major Floyd Parks, the squadron commander, died when his Buffalo exploded in a ball of flame just 500 feet above the lagoon. Despite the carnage in the air, Tomonaga's bombers found Midway's defenses more stubborn than expected. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every corner of the atoll as Marines manning obsolete weapons fought with desperate courage. As Tomonaga's formations headed back to the carriers, the lieutenant radioed a message that would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack wave. Meanwhile, 170 miles to the northeast, Admiral Fletcher had launched his own strike forces based on the last reported position of the Japanese carriers. At 0700 hours, Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, began their approach to the enemy fleet, flying obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators. These 15 American crews were embarking on what amounted to a suicide mission. As reported in the official U.S. Navy historical records, Waldron had trained his men relentlessly, drilling them on Japanese carrier recognition and tactics until they could identify enemy ships in their sleep. Now, as the Devastators skimmed just 50 feet above the Pacific surface, Waldron spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships on the horizon. He pressed his radio transmitter. "Attack immediately. I am going in." What followed was one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval aviation history. Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked the Japanese carriers in the face of overwhelming opposition. 36 Zeros dove on the slow, lumbering Devastators, while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with deadly blossoms of steel and smoke. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down. Waldron's aircraft exploded in flames. His wingman cartwheeled into the sea. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 Devastators had been destroyed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket among the wreckage, watching the Japanese carriers as they prepared for what they believed would be their moment of ultimate triumph. But Gay's sacrifice, and that of his squadron mates, had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. High above, invisible to Japanese radar, the dive bombers were approaching, and the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered through his cockpit canopy at 35 dauntless dive bombers following him in perfect formation. The Enterprise Air Group commander had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, his fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return. Below him, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no sign of the enemy fleet. McCluskey faced an agonizing decision. His aircraft were already approaching their maximum range, and if he continued searching much longer, his entire squadron would run out of fuel before reaching the Enterprise. But something, intuition, luck, or divine providence, made him notice a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at maximum speed. The Arashi had been left behind after depth charging the American submarine Nautilus, and now she was desperately trying to rejoin the main fleet, following the destroyer's wake like a highway in the sky. McCluskey led his dive bombers toward what would become one of the most decisive moments in military history. At 10:24, the lookouts aboard the Akagi spotted the approaching American aircraft. But it was too late. The Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible situation, their flight decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing for another strike on Midway. As the surviving ships of both fleets limped away from the Midway area, the strategic implications of the battle were already becoming clear. Japan's southward expansion had been stopped, her naval aviation rendered ineffective, and her ability to conduct major offensive operations severely curtailed. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned, though few realized on June 7, 1942, that Japan would never again achieve a significant victory against American forces. On June 13, 1942, 9 days after the last shots were fired at Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood before a gathering of war correspondents in Pearl Harbor, his weathered face reflecting both the exhaustion of command and the quiet satisfaction of a victory that had exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet had just received confirmation that all four Japanese fleet carriers attacked during the battle had been sunk, along with their irreplaceable air groups and experienced crews. The strategic implications of the American victory were staggering in scope. Japan's Kitabutai, the fast carrier strike force that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, had been utterly destroyed. Admiral Yamamoto's carefully hoarded reserves of veteran naval aviators pilots who had trained for years before the war and gained invaluable combat experience in China and the early Pacific campaigns, were now sleeping beneath the waves near Midway Atoll. Their replacement would require years that Japan no longer possessed. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports of the disaster in his bomb-proof shelter beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, struggled to comprehend how such a complete reversal of fortune could have occurred in less than 24 hours. The same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effectiveness just 6 months earlier were now twisted wreckage on the Pacific floor. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, had been shattered by American dive bombers screaming out of the morning sky. The economic ramifications were equally devastating for Japan's war effort. Each of the sunken carriers had required 3 years to build and represented an investment equivalent to constructing 3 battleships. The Akagi and Kaga had been converted from battleship and battlecruiser hulls under the Washington Naval Treaty, making them irreplaceable even if Japan possessed unlimited shipbuilding capacity. The loss of trained aircrew was even more catastrophic. Japan would spend the remainder of the war trying unsuccessfully to replace the pilots lost at Midway. According to the comprehensive analysis published in the Naval War College Review, in 1997, the Battle of Midway marked the decisive turning point in the Pacific War, though this was not immediately apparent to contemporary observers. Intelligence analysts in Washington estimated that Japan retained sufficient naval strength to conduct major offensive operations for at least another year, not realizing that the loss of experienced aircrew had effectively crippled Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force. The American victory had been achieved through a combination of superior intelligence, tactical flexibility, and extraordinary courage under fire. The codebreakers of Station Hypo had provided Nimitz with unprecedented strategic intelligence, allowing him to position his forces for maximum effectiveness. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and other torpedo bomber units had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level at the crucial moment. The precision bombing of Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers had exploited Japanese vulnerabilities with devastating efficiency. For the United States, Midway represented more than a tactical victory. It was proof that American industrial might and fighting spirit could overcome the professional military establishments of the Axis powers. The pilots who had sunk the Japanese carriers were largely reservists and newly trained aviators, yet they had defeated the most experienced naval air force in the world. This psychological boost proved invaluable as America prepared for the long, bloody road to Tokyo Bay. The battle's aftermath also demonstrated the war's increasingly global nature. Within weeks of Midway, American forces were planning offensive operations in the Solomon Islands, beginning the island-hopping campaign that would eventually reach Japan itself. The victory had provided the strategic breathing space necessary for American war production to reach full capacity and for new classes of carriers, aircraft, and pilots to join the fleet in overwhelming numbers. Admiral Yamamoto, reflecting on the disaster from his flagship as the combined fleet retreated toward Japan, reportedly told his staff that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor now faced the grim reality that his surprise attack had merely delayed American entry into a war that Japan could not win. The 6 months of Japanese dominance in the Pacific had ended not with the decisive victory he had sought, but with a defeat so complete that recovery was impossible. As the sun set on June 13, 1942, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, the true significance of the Battle of Midway was only beginning to emerge. For days of fighting around a tiny atoll halfway across the world's largest ocean, the course of World War II had been irreversibly altered. The tide had turned, and it would carry American forces all the way to Tokyo Bay 3 years and 2 months later, when Admiral Nimitz would stand on the deck of the USS Missouri to accept Japan's surrender and bring the Pacific War to its final, victorious conclusion. Admiral Raymond Spruance stood in the flag plot aboard the USS Enterprise, studying the latest reconnaissance reports with a methodical precision that had made him one of America's most trusted naval commanders. The sinking of the Yorktown was a serious blow, but 3 Japanese carriers were already burning on the horizon, and now his search planes had located the 4th and final enemy flattop. At 1600 hours on June 4, 1942, Spruance ordered what he intended to be the decisive strike of the battle. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 25 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, while Lieutenant DeWitt Shumway commanded 14 more from the damaged but still operational Hornet. Their target was the carrier Hiryu, now alone and defiant in the gathering darkness of the Pacific evening. As the American formation approached the last surviving ship of Nagumo's once mighty fleet, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of red that seemed prophetic of the blood that had already been spilled in these waters. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto had no illusions about his ship's fate. The Hiryu was surrounded by burning Japanese carriers. Her successful strikes against the Yorktown had exhausted most of her aircraft, and American dive bombers were approaching with vengeance in their hearts. Yet Yanagimoto, embodying the ancient samurai code that still influenced Japanese naval officers, was determined that his ship would die fighting. He ordered his remaining Zeros into the air, knowing they faced impossible odds. The aerial battle that followed was brief but savage. The few Japanese fighters that managed to intercept Gallagher's formation fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defending not just a ship, but the honor of the Imperial Navy itself. Zero pilot Warrant Officer Kyoto Furuya shot down to American dive bombers before his own aircraft was riddled with machine gun fire. He managed to crash his burning fighter into the sea rather than allow it to be captured, taking the secrets of its design with him to the bottom. The explosion tore through the wooden planking and ignited aviation fuel stored in the hangar deck below. 3 more bombs followed in rapid succession, each one adding to the inferno, consuming Japan's last operational fleet carrier. According to records maintained by the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force Historical Division, Captain Yanagimoto's final hours aboard the Hiryu had become legendary in Japanese naval history. As his ship burned around him, the captain refused all entreaties from his crew to abandon ship. He had decided to go down with his vessel, following a tradition that stretched back to the earliest days of the Imperial Navy. His executive officer, Commander Kanukaku, chose to remain with his captain, and both men were last seen standing on the bridge as flames engulfed the superstructure. The death of the Hiryu marked the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. In one day, Admiral Yamamoto had lost for irreplaceable fleet carriers and, more importantly, the veteran aircrew that had taken years to train and decades to develop their expertise. The pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor, sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months were now dead, their experience and skill lost forever beneath the waters of the Central Pacific. But even as the Hiryu settled by the stern, her magazines exploding in brilliant flashes that illuminated the gathering darkness, Admiral Yamamoto was not ready to concede defeat. From his flagship Yamato, still 300 miles to the west with the most powerful battleship fleet ever assembled, the architect of Pearl Harbor was planning one final gambit. If he could lure the American carriers within range of his big guns, he might still salvage victory from the wreckage of Operation Me. At 2100 hours, Yamamoto ordered his entire battle fleet to advance toward Midway at maximum speed. The battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Mutsu, each mounting guns capable of sinking any ship afloat, would attempt to force a night surface action where American air power would be neutralized. It was a desperate plan, but Yamamoto knew that Japan's position in the Pacific would never again be as favorable as it was on this night of June 4th, 1942. The stage was set for the final confrontation of the Battle of Midway, with the fate of the Pacific War hanging in the balance. As 2 of history's greatest naval commanders prepared for what might be their last encounter on the dark waters between Japan and America, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato. As midnight approached on June 4th, 1942, watching the distant glow of his burning carriers fade into the darkness, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months, now faced the realization that those 6 months were ending in catastrophic defeat just one day, short of the anniversary of Midway's completion as an American base. 300 miles ahead, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise was weighing his own fateful decision. Intelligence reports indicated that powerful Japanese surface forces, including several battleships, were approaching from the northwest. The temptation to pursue and complete the destruction of Yamamoto's fleet was enormous, but Spruance's cautious nature and his responsibility to protect the approaches to Hawaii argued for prudence over glory. At 0200 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto made his choice. Despite having the most powerful battleship fleet ever assembled at sea, including the Yamato with her 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, he ordered his forces to withdraw. The Japanese admiral had concluded that without air cover, his battleships would be sitting targets for American carrier aircraft at dawn. The dream of forcing a decisive surface action, where Japanese superiority in night fighting might overcome American air power, died with the order to retire, as documented in the post-war interrogations conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Yamamoto's decision to withdraw represented a profound shift in his strategic thinking. The man who had built the Imperial Navy's carrier force now recognized that the age of the battleship was over. His own Yamato, the most expensive warship ever built, was already obsolete, rendered impotent by the dive bombers that had destroyed his carriers. In 5 minutes of hell that morning. Meanwhile, the drama of the Yorktown was reaching its climax. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's crew had abandoned their carrier the previous afternoon, believing her to be sinking, but the ship proved remarkably resilient. As dawn broke on June 5th, the Yorktown was still afloat, listing heavily but refusing to die. Admiral Fletcher ordered the destroyer Hammond alongside to provide power and begin salvage operations, while damage control parties reboarded their ship with renewed hope. The salvage effort seemed to be succeeding when disaster struck at 13:36. Commander Yohachi Tanabe's submarine I-168, which had been stalking the American task force for hours, achieved perfect firing position and launched for torpedoes at the stationary carrier. The torpedoes struck the Yorktown, but more tragically, one hit the destroyer Hammond, breaking her back and sinking her within minutes. The explosion killed 81 American sailors and wounded many more, adding to the battle's growing casualty list. The torpedo attack sealed the Yorktown's fate. The carrier, which had survived the morning's bomb attack and seemed on the verge of being saved, now took on water faster than her pumps could handle. As the ship settled deeper by the bow, Captain Buckmaster made the painful decision to abandon ship for the second time. In 24 hours, at 0500 hours on June 7th, the USS Yorktown rolled over and sank, taking with her the battle flags of 3 previous engagements and the hopes of her crew for a miraculous recovery. But the loss of the Yorktown, tragic as it was for her crew and for American morale, could not obscure the magnitude of the victory achieved at Midway. In 4 days of fighting, the United States Navy had destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and more than 250 aircraft. More importantly, Japan had lost many of her most experienced naval aviators, men whose skills could not be replaced in the abbreviated training programs that would characterize the rest of the war. The human cost of the battle was sobering for both sides. Japan lost approximately 3,057 men, including some of her finest pilots and most experienced carrier crews. American casualties totaled 362 dead, including the heroic crews of Torpedo Squadron 8 and the many pilots who died attacking the Japanese fleet. Each loss represented years of training and irreplaceable experience, but Japan's losses were proportionally far more devastating to her war effort. Vice Admiral Nagumo had been receiving conflicting reports throughout the morning. First, Lieutenant Tomonaga had requested a second strike on Midway. Then, a reconnaissance aircraft had reported American ships to the northeast, but the pilot was unclear about their composition. Were they merely cruisers and destroyers, or did they include the carriers that Nagumo desperately wanted to avoid until he was ready? In his indecision, Nagumo had ordered his attack aircraft rearmed from ship-killing torpedoes to land attack bombs, then back to torpedoes again. The result was chaos on the Japanese flight decks. Ordnance crews frantically moved bombs and torpedoes while fuel lines snaked across the wooden decks. Aviation gasoline pooled in dangerous puddles, and armed aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip, creating the perfect conditions for catastrophe. When McCluskey's dive bombers appeared overhead at exactly 10:25, they found targets that could hardly have been more vulnerable. According to records from the Naval Historical Center, what happened next unfolded with devastating precision. McCluskey himself dove on the Kaga, his 1,000-pound bomb striking near the island's superstructure and detonating the aviation fuel and ordnance stored on deck. The explosion triggered a chain reaction among the fueled aircraft that turned the carrier into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, struck the carrier Soryu. 3 bombs hit the Japanese carrier within minutes, igniting the same deadly combination of fuel and ordnance that was consuming her sister ships. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 large carriers were burning wrecks, their experienced air crews trapped below decks or consumed in the flames. The scene aboard the stricken Japanese carriers was apocalyptic. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge, watching in stunned disbelief as his flagship died around him. Smoke poured through the superstructure, while secondary explosions shook the massive vessel. Captain Taijiro Aoki begged the admiral to transfer to a cruiser, but Nagumo seemed paralyzed by the catastrophe. Finally, his staff physically carried him from the bridge as the Akagi's magazines began exploding in sequence. The Kaga suffered an even more horrific fate. A direct hit on her aviation fuel storage triggered an explosion so powerful that it blew aircraft completely off the flight deck. Within minutes, the entire forward section of the ship was engulfed in flames hot enough to melt steel. Captain Jisaku Okada went down with his ship, choosing death over the shame of surrender. In those 5 miraculous minutes between 10:25 and 10:30 on June 4th, 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific War shifted decisively. Japan had lost not only 3 irreplaceable fleet carriers, but also most of the veteran aircrew. That had made her naval aviation the world's most formidable fighting force. The road to Japanese defeat in the Pacific had begun with 5 minutes of American dive bombers. Screaming out of the sky above Midway, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, the sole survivor of Nagumo's once mighty First Air Fleet, watching pillars of black smoke rise from his burning sister ships on the horizon. As the only Japanese carrier still operational, Hiryu carried the hopes of the entire empire on her flight deck. Yanagimoto, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, knew that Japan's Pacific Empire now hung by a thread, and that thread was his ship. At 10:40 on June 4th, 1942, Yanagimoto launched every available aircraft in a desperate counterattack against the American carriers. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the last known position of Task Force 17. Their mission simple: sink as many American carriers as possible before the Hiryu joined her. Burning sisters on the bottom of the Pacific, the strike found the USS Yorktown at approximately noon, just as Admiral Fletcher's flagship was recovering aircraft from the morning's successful attacks on the Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, leading the Yorktown's combat air patrol, tried desperately to intercept the incoming Japanese formation, but several of those broke through the American fighter screen. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck near the island's superstructure, penetrating to the 4th deck before exploding and causing massive structural damage. 2 more bombs followed in quick succession. The second hit amidships, knocking out boiler room number 1 and reducing the carrier's speed to 6 knots. The third bomb struck near the forward elevator, starting fires that threatened the aviation fuel storage areas. Within minutes, the Yorktown was dead in the water, listing to port and wreathed in smoke. Many observers believed America's newest carrier was doomed, but the Yorktown proved remarkably resilient. Damage control teams, led by Lieutenant Commander John Greenbacker, worked miracles in the bowels of the burning ship. They showed up bulkheads, fought fires with foam and water, and gradually restored power to critical systems. By 13:30, the carrier was making 20 knots again and recovering aircraft. To Japanese reconnaissance pilots circling overhead, she appeared to be a different ship entirely, perhaps a 4th American carrier that intelligence had missed. As documented in the official action reports housed at the National Archives, Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, was receiving increasingly desperate radio messages from the burning carriers of the First Air Fleet. The architect of Pearl Harbor realized that his entire strategic concept was collapsing. Operation Me had been designed to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle, but instead of destroying American naval power, he was watching his own irreplaceable carriers burn. At 14:30, Captain Yanagimoto launched a second strike from the Hiryu, 10K torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tominaga's aircraft had been damaged in that earlier mission, and his fuel tank had been punctured by anti-aircraft fire. He knew this would be a one-way mission, but he pressed forward anyway, determined to strike a blow for the Emperor. This second Japanese attack group found the Yorktown, again, approaching from the southwest as the American carrier was still recovering from the earlier damage. The ship's radar detected the incoming formation at 25 miles, but there was insufficient time to launch additional fighters. The 6 Wildcats already airborne dove into the Japanese formation with desperate courage, shooting down several Kates, but unable to stop them all. For Japanese torpedoes struck the Yorktown on her port side, the explosions lifting the massive ship bodily out of the water. The carrier immediately took on a severe list to port, and within minutes, Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship, as the crew reluctantly left their dying vessel. They could see other American carriers still operating in the distant Enterprise and Hornet, untouched and ready to continue the fight. Lieutenant Tominaga never returned from this mission. His damaged Kate, leaking fuel throughout the attack, crashed into the Pacific somewhere between the American and Japanese fleets. But his sacrifice had achieved what seemed impossible just hours earlier, a Japanese victory against overwhelming odds. The Hiryu had struck back at America's newest carrier, proving that the war in the Pacific was far from over. Yet even as the Yorktown settled deeper into the Pacific swells, American search planes were already reporting the position of the Hiryu to Admiral Spruance. The final act of the Battle of Midway was about to begin.